Hello, my name is ScienceBeard and I'm looking at a press release which I came across some time ago. And like cheap wine and cottage cheese, this hasn't aged well. I will, however, mainly use the claims made in the press release, paired with the wine of Google and crackers of fact-checking. Okay, this says who they are and what they do. They say that 30 Nobel Prize winners have written for IEA. Wow. They have a blind peer review process. Great! Well, I say great, that's quite intimidating for little old me. A big organization with Nobel Prize winners publishing peer-reviewed work? Never mind. Briefings and current controversies are designed to provide briefings on important issues, are produced rapidly, are short, and are not peer-reviewed. Sometimes they review other published work. I think we're going to be okay. Nevertheless, an august think tank, above reproach. They would never do something intentionally bad, would they? Think tank faces double investigation after cash for access claims. Well, to be fair, this is more than a year old at this point. They will have learned from their mistakes, no doubt. Oh, for goodness sake, IEA. Still, Shankar Singham. I promise to leave this alone, although the name does ring a bell. Director of the IEA's trade unit and author of this new report, Shankar Singham, illustrates how this is partly down to the distortive effects of the CAP. Oh, for goodness sake! The World Trade Organization basically oversees the minimum standards for countries trading with other countries. Most countries want something better, something mutually negotiated. Virtually no country wants to be trading on these terms, partially because they are aimed at countries with a rampant corruption problem, and probably also because there are so many countries involved, with competing interests that agreements often fail at some hurdle. Oh, and many products have to be considered individually. I wish I could give you a handy summary, but there isn't one. And as said, many countries have opposing views, so pointing the finger at one bloc's or country's policy is a bit of a red herring. Anyway, back to the press release about the report. It is often argued that a US-UK free trade agreement means the UK will be forced to open its market to agricultural produce that is dangerous to human and animal health. Despite support from farming and environmental bodies, as well as senior Conservative Party members Neil Parish and Simon Hoare, a move to secure a level playing field for UK producers once the country leaves the EU was beaten by 328 votes against 277 for. National Farmers Union Scotland's Director of Policy Johnny Hall said that while it was unsurprising that the amended bill did not pass, it was still disappointing. Level playing field is of course subjective. You might want a playing field with no rules and regulations and see that as level, or one with high standards which most of your peers have to abide by if they want to sell your country something. To use a sports analogy, imagine that the US team was allowed to kick and carry a football as they liked. The British team has to abide by normal footy rules. That's sort of like what we have here. At this point, the report claims that US chicken is no less safer and maybe even safer than EU chicken. However, trying to compare food poisoning rates is problematic. Turns out you can't really compare rates of food poisoning between the US and UK. You shouldn't therefore compare rates of food poisoning. And before you say bias, this was a claim by Jolyon Moore QC, a lefty PC snowflake. Here the report twists itself into knots. They say that the EU's approach to animal welfare is restrictive, but it is also left to individual countries to police their own farmers. Okay, so this means that there isn't an EU inspection regime, doesn't it? Countries are left to it? As an example of how the market regulates itself, McDonald's is cited. They switched to free-range eggs without legislation. Good for them. But the report also complains that in the EU the ban on battery cages only led to enriched cages. So the implied claim here is that private companies are self-regulating. But aren't the egg producers in the EU all private? So they aren't self-regulating. Sounds anecdotal to me at best. Could it be that McDonald's were nudged to change their behavior by customer demand? In an age of awareness about healthy eating habits and increasing animal welfare concerns, could it be that McDonald's made that decision to improve their business? The tagline is revealing. Will it revive the fast food giant? So this move was totally voluntary. It's not like they needed to improve their image. And just below that, the first sentence mentions an antibiotic-free chicken. The use of antibiotics can't be problematic though, can it? Here's an article detailing the problems with the overuse of antibiotics. Well, that's alright then. Overuse is particularly prevalent in developing countries, because pathogens resistant to treatment stay where they are, of course. Unless you start importing products produced to lower standards, I'm guessing. Another question is, how can you keep the moral high ground and tell developing countries to stop it, if, as a developed nation, you yourself overuse antibiotics? Anyway, private companies can be relied on to make the right moral choice because, money isn't an issue. Ah, snap. This is in no way a retrograde step in animal welfare. Food costs form a higher proportion of lower-income households' budget, accounting for 14% of all low-income household spending. Poorer households spend more of their budget on food than richer ones. Shocking. Quick, let's not pay low-paid workers more. Let's lower the cost because A, that won't impact on the standards of production away from rules and regs, and B, that will work forever. Also, this in no way means that only the richer households can choose to eat food produced to higher, even voluntary standards such as organic food. Will it? I've already talked about the WTO and the problems with getting anything done. I find a couple of things interesting here. Risk management, for example. They want to base risk management on scientific evidence. Let's take GMO, genetically modified organisms. There has been a lot of hysteria about frankenfoods and killer tomatoes, but a more permissive approach is not a solution in itself. Cross-pollination does occur. Companies can't be trusted to behave themselves even in their pursuit for fair treatment, when the most important but least qualified jury, the public, can't agree on GMO's dangers, though there may be none. And yes, I'm picking Monsanto here because they are extremely divisive when it comes to opinion, and they just can't help making themselves look like the bad guy. To wit, Monsanto attacks scientists after studies showed trouble for wheat killer dicamba. Monsanto's newest GM crops may create more problems than they solve. How Monsanto's GM cotton sowed trouble in Africa, etc., etc. I'm not convinced that you can rebuild the image of British farming when the GMO resistance, no pun intended, started in the UK apparently. There's a bright future for UK farmers if these policy choices are adopted. Transitional arrangements will be needed, but a more open and liberal farm policy will be beneficial for UK farmers, the food industry and consumers alike. So how do farmers like a bit of liberalization and cutting of regulations? The NFU recognized that a quarter of all regulations concerning farming were derived from EU directives. That means, however, that 75% were not. It also identified some areas which worked well and some that needed to be reviewed. It also appreciated keeping in line with close trading partners where necessary or appropriate. Fair enough. So how have they done since then? There's a briefing which I can't access, but they have come together with other food and farming bodies to set Brexit objectives, and that is called a manifesto I can access. Just briefly, they have 4 urgent calls: to maintain free and frictionless trade, to ensure ongoing access to an adequate supply of labour, to continue to promote food production through agricultural policy, and to ensure businesses operate under an efficient and proportionate regulatory system. The Federal Trust for Education and Research finds that there is friction, there will be paperwork, and there won't be a replacement program for a long time. But these are anti-Brexit people. What about proper people? The Institute for Government? No, I don't mean centre-left people, I mean proper people. That's better. So the government is not that bothered by a smooth, frictionless continuation of relations with the EU. So far, 0 out of 4 urgent calls met. Dang. Labour supply's a little low as well? And yes, this information predates current travel restrictions. Still 0 out of 4. Who thought? You leave a club whose aim it was to reduce restrictions and checks and replace that with mutual trust, and just because you quit, now they want you to fill in lots of forms and check your stuff? Outrageous! Nobody could have seen that coming. Still 0 out of 4, and I've already talked about high standards in environmental health and animal welfare, which, to remind you, was a prominent feature of UK public opinion and policy. So how do farmers feel about the current situation? Full of opportunity, right? Optimism and looking forward to feeling increasingly gloomy about Brexit. UK farmers feeling stark impact of deal uncertainty. Environmental Secretary faces UK farmers' anger over food standards. Not great then. But who are those farmers and what do they know about farming? It's like asking teachers about teaching, a ridiculous notion. To be clear, I haven't looked at the report. I read the press release on it. But so far I found that the author has potentially broken the law, farmers are unhappy with not having their urgent calls met, and there may be some problems with contradictions such as how restrictive the EU is but not restrictive enough. Private companies can regulate themselves and we don't want regulations, but we are protecting higher standards which we have to since otherwise we will be outcompeted and private industry thinks that megafarms are the way forward, which can operate outside of the lax EU regulations? My question is just this. If I can Google and find out stuff which clearly contradicts the claims of experts in a think tank, then why do we still have think tanks driven by ideology? They are more like clubs with preformed opinions, it seems, where reason and facts don't matter. I've only looked at one aspect and a press release at that. I might return and see whether they have done better elsewhere. Bye.